So what is applied behavior analysis? Most people go, well, it's an autism treatment. Whoa, hold your horses. It's not an autism treatment. That's an area of application. Let's back up a little bit. I'm starting to speak quickly again, I think. I'm going to slow myself down. Take a breath. All right. I'm getting excited. Applied behavior analysis is an area of science. It's a field of science. And there are many people in the science of applied behavior analysis who don't do anything related to autism. Many, many people who do that. And if you think back to that most famous psychologist of the 20th century, B.F. Skinner, many of you certainly recognize his name. You might associate him with Harvard University and doing basic research with rats and pigeons and operant Skinner boxes, operant chambers, where he was discovering essentially the laws of behavior, and then those were later extrapolated and applied to the human population, to the great benefit of the human population. B.F. Skinner, he was around at a time where the cognitive revolution was taking place. He was seeing that there was more focus on explaining events, what we do and how we learn by looking inside the skin, coming up with mentalisms, and he referred to a lot of those hypothetical constructs as explanatory fictions. I love that term. Right? We explain this person's learning or lack of learning by some variable inside their skin, and but it doesn't exist in the physical matrix of the real world. It is an explanatory fiction. It's some words that seem to explain things, but doesn't actually do that. So he wanted to take a different approach to the study of psychology, which is a natural science approach. Right? He was very interested in the natural sciences like physics and chemistry and math and engineering, where you don't have to invent explanatory fictions for phenomenon. You can simply observe the phenomenon in the real world, right? In real time. You can observe the movement of objects in terms of physics in real time. You can observe the interactions of chemicals and see the effects. You don't have to infer them or invent explanatory fictions. And so he thought it really makes sense to apply that natural science approach to the study of behavior. And this led to what you could kind of summarize as the science of consequences, right? We are the science of consequences. He identified that most of what we do, right, there are different types of behavior, but I'm not going to dive into that lesson. A lot of what we do, and that matters in education and in terms of parenting our kids, and as a parent myself, I know this to be true as a parent, it's selection by consequences, right? We're always in certain environments. There are these antecedent conditions around us. And given the conditions around us, we engage in certain behaviors, and then there are consequences to those behaviors. And those consequences will either strengthen the behavior, and you'll keep doing them, which is what you want to be seeing in an educational program at school. Or they can be neutral consequences. They have no effect. The behavior doesn't necessarily get strengthened. Or they could be consequences that weaken behavior so that you're less likely to see that, right? It is the science of consequences. And it can seem at times overly simplistic, but as a pragmatist, you have to appreciate it's parsimonious. And parsimonious is this fancy word in science that means simple, right? We appreciate simple explanations for phenomenon, or parsimony means that you should seek the simplest explanation for phenomenon before going to more abstract or complicated explanations of phenomenon, right? So if we can explain learning by looking at what's happening in the environment, that is parsimonious. That is the learning through consequences. And it is better in terms of its parsimony than trying to invent explanatory fictions inside the skin to explain the phenomenon. Oh, I keep touching myself. Am I interrupting my mic? Okay, all right. So behavior is selected by consequences. Now I'm going to take you through, bear with me, right? This is a little bit of ABA 101. Our field was defined by some of our founding fathers, and we had many founding fathers and important women founding mothers of behavior analysis, back in 1968 through 7 dimensions. There are 7 dimensions that define what is ABA. And if you apply these 7 dimensions to an educational program, they would overlap and map on nicely. So the first, obviously, it's applied behavioral and analytic. You see the ABA right there. So applied means applied to socially significant human behavior. And it's really important that we take a moment to think about what is the definition of applied when we dig deep. It is in the definition of our science that applied means that we target behaviors for change, or for learning if you prefer, that benefit the individual. They are not things that we target because they benefit other people or they're for the convenience of other people, right? So for example, if we had an adult who said, I would really like him to just be quiet, right? It would be a valuable outcome if you teach him to be quiet. That's not necessarily an applied objective for the individual. That's actually to meet the needs of somebody other than the individual. It's for the convenience of others. And so this goes back to 1968 and the defining of our field, that we focus on socially significant behavior that is important to the individual, that benefits the individual. It's not for the convenience of other people, right? And we really take that to heart. This is another kind of soapbox moment that I'll jump up and down off of a few times. It used to be that there were misconceptions of applied behavior analysis. I used to do workshops where we would start by filling a board. We would ask the audience, what have you heard about ABA that's not good? And we would fill the board with misconceptions. And then we would take time to dispel those misconceptions. And over the last 10 years or more, I've stopped doing that practice because people usually don't come in with misconceptions anymore, right? It seems that we've corrected those things, which is great. But more recently, there are some concerns in people who have negative opinions of applied behavior analysis. And it's because they're thinking we're trying to exert control over individuals or to get people to simply conform, and that is not the case. And that's a point that I'll probably come back to because it's important to recognize we are here to help the individual achieve meaningful outcomes for themselves, not because I think it's important or because other people think it's important, right? So I just want to take a moment to hammer that home. The next is that we are, and this is related to the IEP because when you come up with short-term objectives, they should meet this definition of applied. We are teaching our students these things because they matter for the student's benefit, either in the short term or the long term. Behavioral and analytic means it is observable, right? What we are targeting is observable. That's the behavioral dimension. We can all go in and observe the phenomenon of interest and agree that it's occurring or not occurring. The learning is there or not there. And that allows, if you can observe it, then you can measure it. And that's the analytic aspect, where I want to be able to see it, I want to be able to measure it, because that will bring about the most change. And this totally maps onto individual education plans, because good objectives are observable, measurable objectives on which we can collect data. Now the next two of my favorite, are the science of behavior analysis, behavioral science if you prefer, is conceptually systematic and technological. And conceptually systematic means that you can explain most phenomenon by applying basic principles, right? So if I see this going on, I can explain this particular behavior, whether it's a problem behavior, post-social behavior, right? Lack of learning, by applying basic core principles. And when I see the next phenomenon, I can apply more or less the similar types of basic core principles to explain it, which means it allows us to kind of simplify problems. You don't need to go back to the drawing board and come up with new philosophical ideas about how to explain everything that's going on, right? If you understand basic principles of human behavior, you can harness their power, and that will help you understand a lot of what's going on in schools and with learning and with the education of students with autism. That's related to number 5, technological. Technological means we can take these interventions that have shown to be successful or have promise in the research, and we can manualize them and we can share them with other people, right? Which also shows us that there's no magic behind this. This is just good science. If a dentist discovers a new effective root canal procedure, then they can manualize that and they can share it with all dentists. It's not that you have to go to that one dentist because they've got the magic touch, right? If you ever hear of interventions for kids with autism where it's very specialized, you can't possibly do it, you have to go to this one person, the one person's got the magic touch, red flags should be going up, alarm bells going off. Technological means if it works, we can share it with other people, right? And so I appreciate that about our defining characteristics of our science. And finally, that we are effective and we achieve generality. And effective means that we bring about real-world change, as opposed to needing to apply complicated statistics to go, yes, we can detect a statistically significant change. I'm not concerned about statistically significant changes. I'm concerned about real-world change, right? Either my student, my client, learns what we're trying to teach, or they don't learn. They acquire the skill or they don't acquire the skill, right? That is the effective element of applied behavior analysis. And then finally, generality. What's the point of all of this if we don't achieve behavior change, learning that they can then take outside of the instructional setting and apply in meaningful ways throughout the rest of their life, right? It can't just matter in here, it needs to matter out there. That's generality. So a lot of this, you can see this just makes pragmatic, practical sense, and you can appreciate how this maps onto what you're trying to achieve with an individual education plan, right? So that was kind of broad strokes. What is the science of applied behavior analysis? Let me back up or go down and nail down what is ABA treatment for autism, right? More specifically, it's a treatment program comprised of a curriculum targeting language and communication skills, social interactions, imitation and play, fine and gross motor skills, cognitive, pre-academic, academic skills, adaptive daily living skills for independence and autonomy, as well as things like numeracy and literacy and eating and sleeping and toileting and other types of life skills. So An ABA program can target any of these things. And you note that all of these things most of these things are relevant to an individual education plan. So an ABA program would have the same function as an IEP program, right, to bring about learning in these domains. Quickly, I would just note that you'll notice, well, you're saying that ABA does language and communication. Well, doesn't the speech pathologist do that? Absolutely. It's important to recognize that there are huge areas of overlap of the professional scope of practice of speech-language pathologists and behavior analysts, right? There are things that we both can be working on. We both have research to support working on those things, and it's also important to recognize that this is certainly not a complete overlap. There are many, many things that speech-language pathologists are trained in that I have no knowledge of or expertise in, and I shouldn't be addressing. And there are many areas that, similarly, that a behavior analyst has that a speech-language pathologist doesn't have. You see the fine and gross motor skills, and you think, well, we've got the OT for that. Absolutely, you have the OT for that. It's another example where there's a huge overlap of scope of practice between the two professions. I have taught countless kids how to hold a pencil and print and color and paint. I've taught countless kids how to ride their bike and tie their shoes. So have occupational therapists, right? It's just important to recognize that there's a complete overlap of practice areas in many of those places. So it's appropriate for both professionals to be involved, or just one professional to be involved, to make sure there's not too many cooks in the kitchen. So we do all of this. If you ask, well, what do you do with your clients, Richard? We identify targets in all of these domains that will bring about meaningful change to the person's life, and we teach those things. So the last bit there says using empirically validated teaching procedures for skill acquisition while reducing problem behaviors and focusing on transitioning and generalizing skills to the natural environment. That's a really great definition. Using empirically validated teaching procedures, right? That's where you go to something like the National Autism Center Standards Report to find out what are some of those things. And we want to be reducing problem behaviors, not for the convenience of other people, because problem behaviors are annoying to somebody, but because they interfere with the opportunity for our students to maximize their learning potential, right? They're barriers to learning. And then, of course, transitioning and generalizing to the natural environment. The only lesson worth teaching is a generalized lesson, where you take what I've taught you here and you can use it out there, which applies to all learning, right? If you go and take a cooking class, you're not learning to learn skills that you can only use in cooking class. The whole point of this special instruction is to go home and use it with your friends and family, if you could have friends and family over with COVID, right? So the point of learning is to generalize.